Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Environmental Justice Committee of ANC3C. I'm Commissioner Rourke McCorston, who's he, him pronouns, and I represent 3C04 in Cleveland Park. Happy to see fellow commissioners who have joined, Commissioner Nash, Commissioner Siddiqui, and others who are off camera. And for the first meeting of our committee, I've invited special guest Charlotte Dreitzen to speak with us about recycling in DC. Charlotte is a director of sustainability and environment at Plastics, who joined the association in fall of 2022 to lead work related to plastics in the environment. Prior to that, Charlotte ran recycling programs with the DC Department of Public Works Office of Waste Diversion and educated companies on recyclable and compostable packaging with the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. So my thought in inviting Charlotte this evening was to talk about how we here in Ward, well, in 3C, in Ward 3 and across the district, could be better recyclers. I think there are a lot of questions out there about what is recyclable, what's not. It's constantly being discussed, like what's actually happening. I've heard from neighbors in my district about how it looks like the trucks that pick up the recycling from the various apartment buildings, that it all just goes into the same place. Is it really being recycled? Things like that. So Charlotte's gonna make a presentation, then we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll start with questions from the other commissioners and then open it up to the public. So without further ado, I will turn over the floor to Charlotte Dreitzen. Thank you for joining us.
You bet. It's my pleasure to join you all. I love nothing more than talking about recycling. So this is really the highlight of my day and week to be able to come on with you guys and talk about how recycling works in DC. And as you mentioned, I'd love to go through a handful of slides that are helpful jumping off points to talk about how the recycling system works, but really excited for conversation and questions, and don't hesitate to drop them into the chat as we go. I'll do my best to keep half an eye on them. Give me one moment now that my Chrome has decided to misbehave, and I should be able to share that here quickly. Oh man, blocking my system preferences. Sorry, y'all. The whole me sharing Zoom 1,000 times before on my computer is really faltering today with some updates, but.
So I'll just jump back in while you're working that out to say if during the discussion, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand. And if Charlotte's able during the presentation to take questions, she will, otherwise we'll do them all together at the end. So it looks like your slides are up. So back over to you.
Thank you. Crisis averted. Wouldn't be the first time that I've had to go slideless, but always happy to have them on hand. Thanks for jumping in there. And it's exactly as you mentioned, I used to be with the Department of Public Works here in DC. I am no longer with the DC government, so I'll qualify everything I say with that this is a really unofficial guide, chock full of hot takes on what I think works really well and what works not so well in the district. There's plenty of both. And to start off, I'd love to look at a couple numbers that can help us contextualize waste and everything that we produce in DC. I think starting with this number is a really helpful one. We generate 1.8 billion pounds of waste in DC citywide every year, which is a huge amount of waste. We are per capita a good bit higher than the average large city in the United States, which is interesting to think about. Even of those cities that have a lot of tourists and have a lot of folks commuting in, we still end up pretty much on top, all things considered. So when we think about how we can, use less material, recycle better, all of the above, it's I think helpful to start with that in mind. And Of course, what comprises that 1.8 billion pounds is a lot of different stuff. And I'm curious if anyone who would be comfortable dropping into the chat has any guesses about what the biggest single material in our waste stream is. Always interested in what folks think, since really how we can better recover material all depends on what it is, and that'll inform the different strategies we have to recycle or compost or trash, if the case might be. Any guesses on what the biggest kind of material is?
Commissioner McCorst and Commissioner Pagets, I think its own chat is only set to chat to host. So I think if you can change that, there should be 3 little dots that say set chat. Everyone can chat with everyone.
I fixed it.
Perfect. And no pressure.
Now it works.
Yeah, a coffee cup guess in there. That's a good one. Appreciate that. Food waste. That's another good one. Lots of food waste going on. Appreciate those guesses. So for the city of DC, and this is really universal across American cities, the single biggest piece of waste that we generate is paper. Next comes food. To that guess of food waste, Mary, you're spot on. Then we have kind of the mix of everything else, then plastic, then bulky waste, which is stuff like furniture, mattresses, and then a handful of categories of smaller items like textiles, which we can recover many of through fabric recycling, metals, yard waste that we can compost, wood, much of which we can compost, and glass, which we can recycle in a lot of places, but have some challenges in DC, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think this is also really helpful just to kind of gut check our assumptions about what we often interact with the most and what we might have some perceptions of making up the biggest part of our stream. And this is all by weight, which is really how the solid waste industry as a whole measures the presence of material by all accounts. So when it comes to how much of that waste that we're actually recovering, I'm curious if anyone has any guesses here too, any real optimists or pessimists about how much out of that total 1.8 billion pounds of waste that we generate citywide, about how much that we recover, which would be recycling or composting. If anyone has any guesses here, I'd be super curious. No bad answers, no bad guesses. 5%, 20%, 15%. Very good. All right, you're dead on, Commissioner here. We're at 16% waste diversion citywide in DC. And this is pretty middle of the pack. There are big cities that do a lot better, like Seattle and San Francisco and Austin. And there are big cities that do a lot worse, like New York and Chicago and Baltimore and others. So this is certainly not a good diversion rate. By all means, we have a lot of room to improve. But we are pretty middle of the pack. And the reason why this is so low is that when we think about the waste that we're generating by sector, we do much better in some places and much worse in others. And this is the breakdown of our diversion rate by sectors. So in the single family sector, which is what we call any dwellings with 3 or fewer units in DC that are serviced by DPW directly, we have a diversion rate of 25%. That's where we do the best. For multifamily, we have a recycling rate of less than half of that, or just about less than half of that, 13%, and businesses do the worst by far, 7%. And the reason why that overall waste diversion rate for the whole city is 16% is because businesses and multifamily make up the vast majority of waste that we produce. Single family only represents about 10%, multifamily is about 12%, and businesses make up the remaining 78, 80% as a whole. So this is, I think, really important to think about when we think about how we could effectively advocate for better zero waste policies. You could have curbside composting all you want in every household in the district, but that's only going to influence the overall diversion rate by 1 or 2%. Where we could get the biggest bang for our bucks in terms of policies are often around the types of policies that would impact businesses and be commercial food waste requirements, commercial recycling requirements. Not that they're not all important, but just in terms of what we get the most bang for our buck for in terms of total pounds of material diverted. Lots of additional considerations that go into play there, but I think this is really illuminating to me personally about where I try and focus the majority of my time and effort personally. When we think about multifamily in particular, so I know, Rorik, you had shared that most residents in your area are multifamily residents where the building is 4 or more units. It could be 4 or 5 small building townhouse, or it could be 500 units or more. They're all governed by the same multifamily recycling requirements as a whole for the city. And DC is unique in having multifamily recycling requirements, or I guess I shouldn't say unique, but not every city has those. It's not something that I take for granted, at least, that we have a really strong legislative and regulatory foundation for multifamily recycling. In a lot of the US, it's the Wild West. And if multifamily buildings aren't serviced by the city, then they can do whatever they like. And that's not the case here in DC. Every multifamily building in DC is required to provide recycling access to their residents, and they're required to provide a lot of different elements of that recycling program. So they have to provide the same universal list of recyclables that single family residents can recycle through DPW. Businesses are required to do the same. We are pretty unique. There are very few cities that have that universal requirement across all sectors, and we are one of them. Multifamily buildings also have to provide pickup at least twice a week. They have to use a registered and licensed hauler that collects trash and recycling separately. They have to provide signage. They have to educate their residents at least once a year. They have to have enough containers for residents to put all of their recycling. Unfortunately, as we likely all know too well, that very rarely happens in practice in a really robust way. And unfortunately, DC hasn't really had a lot of resources or political appetite to go after multifamily and businesses for many things, but for recycling in particular. And that's really starting to change, which is, I think, exciting momentum to see. When I was with the agency for a few years, multifamily recycling was really what I focused on personally. And I developed the Multifamily Zero Waste Guide here, which is a really great resource I'd recommend checking out, that does a deep dive into all sorts of recycling and composting programs that multifamily buildings can implement, as well as really quick one-pagers that spell out exactly what the requirements are. Because before this, the only place you could go to learn that was not even a website. It was straight into the DCMR, which is pretty challenging to navigate, even as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about policy and city services. So when we started to really dig into multifamily recycling, one of the first things that we did was establish a baseline compliance rate. Because to be honest, DC didn't know how many multifamily buildings provide recycling, how many fulfill all the requirements that they should, how many only fulfill one or a couple. And we found that about half of multifamily buildings provided, pretty sufficient recycling programs in terms of the overall amount of containers provided. About 10 to 20% didn't provide recycling at all. And then the remainder provided, some combination of the requirements thereof. Some wouldn't accept all the materials they needed to, some wouldn't have signage, some wouldn't educate their residents. Very few places did everything. I don't even know, to be honest, if we came across a single multifamily building that checked all the boxes. And one of the key pieces, I know you mentioned in the introduction there, were that folks often see trash and recycling being mixed together, which is a really challenging dynamic for the recycling industry to contend with. There are about 100 haulers in DC, and DPW and DCRA regulate them. They have to be licensed, and then they also have to be registered with the Office of Waste Diversion, and they are required to not mix those streams unless it's very contaminated recycling. So if those residents are contaminating the hell out of that recycling, they can and should trash it. That is not something the recycling system can handle. But of course, we see that recycling and trash might be collected together in instances where it's perfectly clean and it really should be going to the right place. And that's a really hard line to walk. And unfortunately, we definitely do see instances of non-compliance. And one of the challenging things about DC's regulatory environment for multifamily recycling is that we require both the hauler to not do that. They can't mix trash and recycling. And we also require the building to use a hauler that doesn't do that. So if you've raised the issue to the hauler is not stopping, you've raised the issue to the building's not stopping, the building can be fined for continuing to use that hauler. You can reach out to Zero Waste DC at zero.waste@dc.gov to report that, and they'll send an inspector out and take a look. These things can be really challenging to document, so it's much easier to have an inspector come by and say, no recycling whatsoever, that's not compliant, than it is to say, sometimes our hauler comes by and mixes material. But it's really important to know that the obligation is on both parties in DC in our recycling system. The hauler can't be mixing those materials, and the building is responsible for selecting a hauler that does that correctly as well. which is kind of interesting and really funky. Not everywhere is like that. One of the other instances we see that being really challenging is that the building is required to ensure that all residents can recycle every material on what we call the mayor's list of recyclables and compostables. So paper, plastic, metal, glass. And glass has a very, very, very low, in fact, a negative value in the recycling market. Every other material generates revenue. And for that reason, a lot of private haulers have stopped collecting glass at multifamily buildings. And there's no obligation for the haulers in DC to collect everything on the mayor's list, but the building is obligated to make sure residents have recycling access. So if your building has dropped glass from its recycling program, if the hauler says we won't take it anymore, the building is responsible for either finding a new hauler or setting up a dedicated specific glass recycling program. They wouldn't be allowed to simply not recycle glass, which is kind of an interesting gap and can be really challenging to navigate in practice. But a smattering of thoughts there on the multifamily requirement side. And for this reason, I think we see a really big gap between what our regulations have on the books and what we see in practice, which leads to some of those really disappointing diversion rates for multifamily and businesses. But to be honest, single family too, 25% diversion rate for single family isn't all that excellent in and of itself. But we also want to be thinking not only about quantity, but quality and recycling contamination. So for instance, we have a 13% diversion rate for multifamily, but we also have a contamination rate that's twice as high as single family. Contamination rates even higher for businesses. So they're recycling less and they're recycling worse, which is really, really challenging. And I think one of the things that can be really easy for people to write off, I think a lot of times we hear businesses need to do their part, I can only do so much, but especially in cities like DC, people really make up the business sector. We don't have industrial manufacturing that's happening in the city. We have people who are patrons in hotels and patrons in restaurants and people working in office buildings and who are managers at those places that have decision-making power over the property management and programs. So I would really encourage when we think about how we can recycle better, especially in the business sector, that a lot of the decisions and cumulative effect are really, compilations of how we all interact in the workplace and when we travel and when we eat out and grab a coffee in the morning and all of the above. A couple of things here. One of the big challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about contamination here in a sec, but one of the big challenges with multifamily and businesses is that they often have chutes and people are often inclined because of that to put stuff in plastic bags. The single biggest contaminant for the recycling system in the whole universe is plastic bags and stuff in plastic bags. So if you take one thing away from the hour we have here together, it's do not ever recycle something in a plastic bag. Businesses and multifamily buildings are permitted to do it in clear plastic film today, and it's insane to me that that's the case. It is a supremely challenging contaminant for the recycling system. And frankly, the single biggest thing that I think we can do as a city is to change that policy so they're prohibited. Because if a janitor can use a plastic bag, if a building can use plastic bags to contain their recyclables, it's so much easier from a janitorial services perspective to do that they're going to do it. In fact, some multifamily buildings require that their residents do it, but to a recycling facility, it doesn't matter where that plastic bag comes from, it jams recycling equipment and requires that the whole facility shut down multiple times a day for those plastic bags to be cut out. Not the only kind of contamination we contend with, but it's the biggest for sure. And they are prohibited in single family recycling. So it's one of the big disparities between the single family and commercial side of things in DC. Talked a little bit about the mayor's list. I won't dwell on this. If you ever want to pore over it, you can totally do it. If you Google DC DPW mayor's list, it'll come right up. It's analyzed every 2 years and assessed to see if there's anything that's changed in the recycling market or in what facilities in the region can accept. And then it informs based on that analysis what the city will require is recycled. So everything, to be honest, that is on this list, you as a resident, you as a business, you as a multifamily building are required to recycle. Even though DPW doesn't exercise fines and enforcement on single family homes, they have that legal ability to. And frankly, that's critical to a lot of the communities in Europe and Canada and lots of industrializing countries too, in seeing diversion rates increase. We really aren't able to see that cities and states and countries are able to achieve zero waste without fining businesses and people for non-compliance. And that's both putting the wrong thing in the wrong bin and for or not participating as a whole. And we see that participation ranges hugely across DC. There are parts of DC where 8 or 9 in 10 households participate in recycling, and we have parts of DC where 2 or 3 households participate in recycling per 10. And we see that contamination varies hugely too. So we see that there are some recycling routes in the city that have 80–90% of homes contaminating the recycling system. And then we have routes that are much cleaner where 3 or 4 in 10 households are contaminating the system. So there's a huge disparity across DC, and that's very common for cities as a whole. New York City is very similar. They have 32 sanitation districts instead of our 8 wards, and they have some districts that have 80-some-odd% diversion rates, super high. They've met zero waste, and then they have some sanitation districts where they've only achieved 2% diversion. So it's definitely a really big challenge, kind of the diversity within a city's geography and how to manage that. So talk a little bit about the difference between single family and commercial. I'll talk a little bit here about the infrastructure and how the system works in practice once stuff is picked up. So as y'all likely know, DPW picks up all trash and recycling from single family homes in DC directly. These are what the trucks look like. One of the big things that I think is really not a smart decision is that in DC, we've wrapped many trucks with recycling branding. To educate on recycling, increase awareness, which is such a lovely idea. But to be honest, we don't have enough fleet control to ensure that those recycling branded trucks go on the recycling routes. So sometimes we'll have people call in, I'm using the royal we now, not being with DC government anymore, but a lot of times DC residents will call into DPW and say, I just saw trash being put into a recycling truck because it says recycling across the side of it. And to be honest, it might just be a truck assigned to that trash route on a given day. This is really confusing and something that we just shouldn't have as the status quo, but does occur. So want to mention. Everything then gets trucked to one of DPW's 2 transfer stations at Fort Totten or Benning Road. I'm sure you all have likely been to one or the other in the past. Unfortunately, Benning Road, which was a very seriously aging facility, had suffered a debilitating fire in July of 2021. And likely due to hazardous materials being disposed of in the recycling or trash stream. And the facility really has to be demoed because of that. It was so old that it was slated for demoing and rebuild anyway, which is really convenient. That if it was going to burn down, it was going to burn down once it already had funding in the capital budget to be replaced. But we're down to one of our 2 transfer stations to collect material as a whole. Unfortunately, that facility is also really aging, so it's undergoing a lot of construction. So right now, the residential drop-off is at Benning Road. The commercial and serious trash trucking, recycling trucking is going to Fort Totten. And it is real hard to manage these facilities. It is really challenging due to transfer waste effectively. And one of the big important evolutions of DC's transfer stations is that a couple years ago, while I was with the agency, we started a screening process. And that basically means people are watching the recycling loads as they come in, and they're assessing them for whether they're clean or dirty. And recycling facilities can only sort recyclables up to a certain contamination threshold. If you bring a load of recycling into a recycling facility that's 50% contaminated, that is too contaminated for the facility to recycle. They can't handle an unlimited amount of contamination. That exact threshold varies by facility, and it generally is in the ballpark of like 15 to 30%. In our facilities here in DC that DPW contracts with, which is Waste Management's Elkridge, Maryland facility in Maryland, and then the Manassas, Virginia facility owned by Republic, the contamination thresholds are about 20%. And to be honest, loads are really binary. There are very few loads that come in that are like, I wonder if it's 18% or 22%, if it's too high or too low. That's really not the case. They genuinely almost always look really good, really clean, or really terrible and really dirty. Which is convenient in terms of the ability to assess them when there's 5-6 trucks dumping in a transfer station at any given time. But one of the big improvements to the recycling system, and this can be a little counterintuitive for some folks, is that now when a really dirty load comes in, it's immediately directed to trash and it does not proceed to the recycling facility. Prior to 2 years ago, a dirty load of recycling would go to the recycling facility and then it would reject it from there. And that means we've burned all the carbon emissions from that extra leg of transport, and it's going to go to a landfill anyway, And on top of that, the recycling facility is going to fine DC because of the contamination. So now that we have the screening process introduced, every single truck that comes into a DC DPW transfer station has kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down on its quality. And that enables the city to understand that, hey, recycling route 72 is doing a really great job. We don't need to send education to that route. But recycling route number 44 has done a terrible job consistently. We should really direct our scarce resources there. And the same goes for commercial haulers. DC doesn't have a practice today of educating commercial haulers and working with them to educate their clients, but they could. And this really enables them to do that and understand, are some haulers sending way more contaminated recycling than others? Why is that? How can we support them in doing better? And importantly, when dirty loads of recycling are now being reallocated to trash, that commercial hauler is being charged a contamination fee. So that's giving negative feedback into the system to try and get that process started on its own, but is one important thing to think about. Gosh, there was one other important piece of that I was going to mention. So in terms of the total amount of material that our transfer stations manage, DPW does not manage 100% of commercial material at the 2 transfer stations. It does manage 100%, of course, of the single family trash and recycling that's generated, but in practice, a majority of trash and recycling collected by the private sector from multifamily and commercial does come through its transfer stations. Haulers can take it anywhere they want, to a private operation or to DPW or to a facility in Maryland or Virginia. Frankly, because DC's rates are low, they often head to DPW's facilities. And there's lots of pros and cons of that. It's a whole can of worms. When it gets collected at DPW's transfer stations, talked a little bit about, it heads to one of the 2 recycling facilities that DC contracts with, and we call these MRFs, like Smurf without the S. It stands for Material Recovery Facility. I'll call it a recycling facility just colloquially, but frankly, sorting happens there. Processing and reprocessing and grinding up of material does not happen at these facilities. They get sorted and then they head to another facility to get processed. So they'll, at these 2 MRFs, create bales, big blocks that are smushed together of plastic and metal and glass and paper, and then head to their final destination. So we've talked a little bit about the overall diversion rate. I wanted to spend just a moment looking at it by material. And I broke this down for single family. And as we've already looked at, single family does a lot better than multifamily and businesses. So this is an observable trend across those sectors, but the numbers look lower, basically. Paper, we do a really great job at 38% or so of diversion. Glass, we do the best job of getting glass into bins. Metal and plastic are lower and in the middle. You can see the trend overall that plastic basically always lags, but it does vary by resin. So resin is the kind of material and kind of plastic, and we do separate it separately at that recycling facility. So I wish I had a water bottle next to me, but I don't. Plastic soda bottles, water bottles are #1 PET, polyethylene terephthalate, and we recycle 42% of those in the single family system. We recycle like 2% of them at businesses. So when we hear about very low plastic recycling numbers, it often follows that trend that we're doing really well in residential and really poorly in businesses for lots and lots of reasons. But the same goes for every material type. Like we do a lot better recycling aluminum cans than we do recycling aluminum foil, and we do a lot better recycling cardboard than we do recycling newspaper. When we look at the overall tonnage, I just wanted to provide this glimpse also because I think it's really revealing. When we look at the recycling rates, I think that's important to think about how much we're getting into a bin and getting recycled over what we're generating, but also sheerly the volume and weight of the material. So we can see here that paper we of course collect and recycle the most of, but plastic honestly comes next. And we have really strong domestic end markets for that material in DC. I do want to take a brief pause here on glass because this is one of the biggest challenges in DC's recycling system, as well as many communities across the US. Glass is collected last at a MRF, at a sorting facility. Paper is pulled out first, 2D paper items, and then 3D sortation happens where 3D containers are separated. Metal and plastic are all pulled out, and then glass comes last. And the reason why we have such a big challenge recycling glass is because it's dirty, because all the paper is pulled out, all the metal is pulled out, all the rigid plastic is pulled out, and that means everything else that's left over is contaminating the glass. So it is super, super, super dirty. This is why most of Northern Virginia developed a glass drop-off recycling program, because their contamination in their glass and the curbside system was so bad that they couldn't recycle it. That is the same case here. So DC requires that glass be recycled, but we do not have an end market for glass, and it's used instead as alternative daily cover at landfills. And that helps to suppress the methane generated from the organic portion of landfills, which is not ideal. That's not a highest and best use of glass material by any means. For context, Maryland, in the state of Maryland, about 50% of glass gets recycled. That's collected for recycling. And then about half, the other half, is used as alternative daily cover for what's collected for recycling. So this is definitely not unique to DC, but is a really big, important reason why we need dedicated source separated glass drop-offs for DC residents, because when you put it into the recycling bin, it does provide some environmental benefit of preventing methane emissions at landfills, but it's not being recycled, and it's valuable material, so we really ought to recycle it. Wanted to talk super briefly here about plastic film. When we think about the overall plastic recycling rate and why that's often lower than others, a big part of it is because plastic film cannot be recycled curbside. As we talked a bit about, plastic bags jam machinery, and pure polyethylene plastic bags can be brought to store drop-off at grocery stores. One of the really, really interesting things I think that would be for folks to advocate for in the future would be universal plastic bag drop-offs at retailers and grocery stores of a certain size to increase that access for folks. But part of the reason why that recycling rate is really low is because you can recycle that material, but not through the curbside program. It has to be brought to a grocery store drop-off. I'll spend just a last few minutes here, and then I'd love to get into questions and conversations about quality and quantity. We've talked about contamination a whole bunch tonight, and I wanted to provide a few visuals to help us think about it. On the left-hand side here is a big pile of clean recycling. We can see visually that most of it looks like cardboard and paper, which aligns with those numbers that we see of the majority, paper has the biggest diversion rate and we generate the most of it. That's why it really dominates our recycling system. On the right-hand side, this is a contaminated load of recycling. So when I talked about how those loads are really, really clean or really dirty, this is a great example of it. This is an example of some really crazy, highly contaminated recycling that you cannot put into a recycling facility because it's so wet and food soiled and there are so many plastic bags. There also are tons of other contaminants in the system. So really always recommend that if you are unsure if you can recycle an item, you definitely should not recycle it, because that is going to risk the entire load of recycling being capable of being recycled if it goes over that contamination threshold. And there's tons of stuff that people put in that are so not recyclable and also can be really damaging to recycling equipment and, to be honest, to workers too. One of the most dangerous jobs in the US is being a sanitation worker. It's for reasons like this. The first 60 seconds I spent at a MRF, this concrete block rolled down on the conveyor belt. And if someone hadn't pulled this off, this would totally screw up machinery, be really expensive and costly to repair. And it was big, like bigger than, someone's head, really substantially sized. So this is like, run of the mill. People put bowling balls, people put propane tanks. Not only are those not recyclable because of their contents, but also big fire hazards, stuff like desk chairs that are all sorts of funky materials, knives, you name it, stuff that could be dangerous for workers. On the right-hand side here is a glimpse of workers removing those plastic bags that are so problematic for machinery. And not only plastic bags tangle around this equipment, but also anything like holiday lights, garden hoses, window blinds, people recycle a lot of, not recyclable. Those jam around recycling equipment in the same way. So workers have to physically climb into recycling equipment and cut out with box cutters all of that material, which is why it's so dangerous, because they can get injured using the box cutters. They can, get injured in the gears of the equipment as well, which is really unfortunate. And depending on the contamination rate of the city, recycling facilities, we only have to shut our facility down, or DC's recycling facilities down, 3 times a day to cut all this contamination out, which is a lot. If you think about a manufacturing process and you were, going to ask I don't know, insert manufacturing company here to shut down their operations 3 times a day and see how that impacts their cost and fiscal sustainability, that would have a pretty big negative impact. The same goes here. And a lot of communities that have even more contamination in their recycling than DC have to shut down 4, 5, 6 times a day, every hour, even in some really bad cases. So when we think about why the recycling system can be really costly and challenging to operate, a lot of it is because contamination and because we're simply not putting the right stuff into the right bin. So stuff can be too big, stuff can be too small. What I talked about, it all falls through the equipment and doesn't get proactively pulled out with paper or containers that are metal or plastic, so it ends up in the glass. If you put shredded paper directly into a recycling bin, or caps, if they're not attached back to the bottle, those are going to end up contaminating the glass, because anything that's under 2 inches by 2 inches falls through the equipment. And it's understandably really challenging, really confusing, something that is frustrating for both residents as well as people who operate the programs, people who are making packaging. To be honest, the capacity in the industry has increased hugely since I started in it about 10 years ago. And a lot of companies that design packaging had never been to a MRF and are making decisions about what their packaging should look like. And they simply didn't understand how the recycling system works. And that's changing immensely. So it's really exciting to see a lot more capacity there. And I want to end here on a really positive, heartening note, and would love to dive into any and all questions after this. But when we think about recycling and how well it's working, I hope I've touched on a number of examples of what's working really well today and what's not. And I think a lot of people understandably are frustrated about recycling or feel cautious. I respect people who are cautiously pessimistic or cautiously suspicious, or really want to understand how it works, because we should always be critical of systems and want to understand them and make sure they're doing the right thing. But in DC, we've had an enormous achievement in the past handful of years with the quality of our recycling for single family residential material. And about 5 years ago, we had a contamination rate of 27%, which is pretty damn bad. And we've been able to work that down to 11% today, which is a really huge achievement. And 27% is pretty bad contamination wise. It's not the worst out of any big city, but it's certainly not the best. And 11% is some of the cleanest residential recycling in the country. And when we think about how facilities can only recycle up to a certain contamination threshold, 5 years ago, we were routinely sending loads that were too contaminated to be recycled. And we can now see at 11% of contamination, it's much rarer. We're routinely sending loads that are clean enough to be effectively sorted and recycled. So I hope that's heartening. I think there's no shortage of things for us to improve as a whole, but I would love to end on that note and shift gears towards questions and conversation. And while I know I've had the chance to connect with a lot of folks online, I'll drop my handles there in case anyone is interested in continuing the conversation there too.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. That was an amazing deluge of information, very educational. I learned a lot. So I feel like we also have to sort some of this information that you've given us.
Absolutely.
So before we get to questions, I would just like to say, I noticed you mentioned a few things we could advocate for policy-wise, things like glass drop-off points like they do in Northern Virginia, or universal plastic drop-off points, which in theory you can picture and then push for at a policy level. I'm also wondering though, what actions we can take more immediately as community members, as a community. So if you say that it's businesses and commercial recycling where we can do a better job, I think about when I go to get a cup of coffee, and I know from your Twitter feed that coffee cups are recyclable in DC, which is not the case everywhere. But I feel it's rare that the Starbucks, or I don't really go to Starbucks, but where the coffee shop will have like a separate bin for the coffee cups, or it's just not clear when they have recycling. Whenever you look in, there's sometimes coffee cups in there and there's coffee cups in the trash. So is there a role we could play as residents, as community members, in putting some pressure on different businesses to, I guess, comply with what the rules they should be following? Or are there other actions that you think we could focus our attention on in terms of immediate action?
It's a great question, and one that I think I wrestle with every day. It's really hard for me to go into a business without checking out their recycling setup also, and would totally encourage. I think that's a really great low-hanging fruit opportunity that none of us go through our day-to-day lives without going to a dry cleaner or a grocery store or a coffee shop. And a lot of times they aren't complying with DC's recycling requirements. In fact, more often than not, I think they fail to. And part of it, I think, is that simply they don't know. I think DC does not yet do a great job of educating businesses on what they need to comply with, but that's not an excuse. They should be complying with the requirements that are on the book. So, piping up and giving a shout to the manager on shift and saying, this is important to me as a customer. This is also a requirement, and it's also the right thing to do is really, really impactful. You can also certainly write DPW and shoot a note to zero.waste@dc.gov and say, I'm a patron of this business, love what they do, but can you pop by and, provide education on recycling and enforce recycling requirements? Because I noticed that they're lacking. And we can all do this in our office buildings that we go to work, and our multifamily buildings as well. And certainly all of those spaces that we float through on a regular basis are really ripe for that support, because I think a lot of times it's simply a lack of awareness, but for sure a lot of times it does take, I think, some fire under seats to shift when there's inertia.
Great, thank you. This is the first committee meeting I've chaired, so correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Pagets, but the commissioners get to ask the first questions. Commissioner Nash put some questions in the chat. Let me know if this doesn't get to the point, but I think that what you're asking is how are the federal buildings and entities within the district accounted for in the statistics and in the numbers recycling and recycling processes. So I take that to mean like the large government buildings downtown, are they lumped into the figures as well that you gave us, and that we kind of have that burden on top of everything else from our local perspective that we're carrying also the actual recycling of the federal facilities here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it does vary. So there are a few things that I would recommend thinking about for that. So first off, federal properties do not have to comply with lots of DC laws. This is one of them. So they are not required to comply with DC's recycling requirements. However, they do in practice by and large. It does depend on whether it's a GSA property, or it depends on the property management of that specific building. When I was with the agency, we had conversations with GSA to learn about how they're doing that and provide recommendations and answer questions from them about how the regional infrastructure works and that kind of thing. Those numbers are accounted for in the estimates, I believe. But there have been requests to receive their data directly for the material they manage, so they can do that more accurately and more precisely. Because there's such a diversity of different ways that property management happens within federal buildings, GSA does have a number of haulers that they use for their properties that they provide management services to that do bring material to DC facilities. So that would be incorporated in those numbers. That measurements are being taken as well, but it does vary. They also do something at all of their properties to provide recycling and trash, but then out of the trash, sort that material. And that's something that we call mixed waste processing. There are some advocates for that because there's such little faith that residents and people can separate recyclables correctly, that some people think that's logical to do, is a backstop, is a fail-safe. And they don't do that exclusively. They do have recycling bins that they direct to recycling, but they also aim to do that with their trash system as a second layer of defense. It's not something that DC actually permits and doesn't have facilities. They don't permit facilities to do that in DC because they don't agree conceptually with that. So those are a few of the funky things that are going on with the federal government, but there are a lot of federal buildings that are not managed by GSA that do not have recycling. So there is room to improve there for sure. It's a great question.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Nash? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. It does. I had another question, but I'm going to defer until others have had a chance to ask theirs.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Siddiqui.
Thank you, Commissioner Nash. Thanks so much for this presentation. I'm a big time fan, so really appreciate all you do and all the education you've given. I guess one question: why doesn't the city provide recycling pickup for multifamily buildings?
It's a really good question. And frankly, I think it's a matter of resources. So when we think about the collection services that DPW provides for single family, they have hundreds of staff and hundreds of trucks. And each truck costs maybe $250,000 and also takes multiple years to order. So let's say tomorrow that we were like blank check, let's have DPW collect for multifamily buildings. That would definitely be, we know that multifamily generates slightly more trash and recycling than single family. So that would probably be, my fast math is terrible, like 4 trucks per $1 million, at least 100 trucks, at least $25 million for capital, and then however much staff on top of that. So I think that massive price tag is really, frankly, the biggest barrier. Very few cities collect multifamily as well as single family. Each city kind of draws the line between the two differently. So some have 6 units, some have 8 units is where they draw the line. New York City is one of the few big cities that does collect from both single and multifamily together. But it's a really good question. And I think that one of the interesting things to think through that we were wrestling with, frankly, while I was with the agency, is that we do recognize there would be benefits to picking up from multifamily. That would not be an easy thing to do, but it's conceivable. There are also a lot of requests for DPW to expand single family composting collection. And that would also take the hiring of dozens of new staff, of dozens of new trucks. And if we're going to do one, if we're going to prioritize one, that probably would be more intuitive within the current framework to wrap our heads around that. So it's a really good question, and I think reasonable minds could differ.
Thanks. Does that answer your question, Commissioner Siddiqui?
It does. I didn't expect you to solve all our problems, but it's good to point out.
Okay, Commissioner Higgins.
I mean, so that brings up another question, like a follow-on question to that is, like, did anybody ever run the numbers on like flipping that to let's pick up from the multifamily homes or the multifamily buildings and the efficiencies that can be created with that rather than running all these trucks and all these great distances to pick up from all these single family homes. Because we're paying a tax in multifamily buildings, having to pay for both the single family homes to pick up their trash, and then we independently are charged HOA or rent to pick up ours.
I think you're totally right that from an efficiency standpoint, multifamily has more material and fewer pickups and is more concentrated, for sure. I think in the reality that we find ourselves with this system, the massive overhaul that it would take to pick up from multifamily and not single family would be so ginormous and such a big political backlash that I can't imagine anyone would meaningfully explore it. But I totally am with you that if we were starting from a blank slate, that I definitely see the value there. It's a really good point.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
Okay, thanks.
Should probably read some of the questions that were in the chat, right?
Yeah, there are a couple about glass that I feel Charlotte answered in her presentation. So yeah, I think you just answered this. Is there any cost to bring bulk materials to the transfer stations in DC? I assume that means for individuals.
That would be my read. And I don't believe there is a cost for bulk to be dropped off at transfer stations. Bulk is really tricky, and we do a bad job of it as a whole, I think. You can schedule pickup as a single family resident, but to your point, Janelle, about the disparity between single and multifamily pickup, it's not something that multifamily buildings are required to provide for their residents. So we often see illegal dumping of bulk waste because people don't have easy access to vehicles to transport it, or it's time consuming to do that, lots of reasons. But I don't believe there is a cost for residents to bring. You do have to provide proof that you're a DC resident to drop off material if you elect to do that. And it is one of the biggest inequities, I think, in terms of how we collect bulk. Because it's so challenging. There's only 2 drop-off points. Like in Baltimore, for instance, I think there's 15 drop-off centers, and they're a less well-resourced city. But part of the big challenge is that in Northwest, there is like 0 industrially zoned land. Like if you had a blank check to build a bulk waste drop-off, you would not have zoned land to do that in DC because of our comprehensive plan. And it's really, I think, unfortunate that our 2 transfer stations are absolutely inaccessible if you don't have a vehicle. There's no sidewalks. You're walking in the street with moving truck traffic if you choose to do that, which is so cuckoo crazy and really a big equity issue that that if you're on foot or taking public transit, you really have a tough time.
Right. Mary asks, I think, about the rate among single family homes. Is the change in contamination rate due to a change in policies or community education, or do you think it was something else?
Oh yeah, great question. So I think this is really due to education and targeted education being applied. So DPW had a budget of about $200,000 to provide recycling education for those years. For almost all of those years, it was just about that much, varied a little bit between one year to the next. And that works out to about $2 per household, which is what the US standard is for what we consider good recycling education costs. And with that budget, the city decided we're going to focus on single family and we're going to focus on plastic bag contamination. So 2 mailers, I think, a year were sent out over the course of those years, plus dedicated cart tagging efforts to the most contaminated routes in each ward. Where we gave direct feedback on the bin. If we saw contamination, we'd leave a sticker saying what the contamination was. And between those strategies, I think, is what we really found critical to lowering the contamination rate there. Again, another big inequity is that DPW funds recycling education for single family in that really robust way, about $2 per household. And a lot of that is through grant funding. That is not native funding to the agency. So really, I think a helpful thing to advocate for more recycling education. And if we think about something that would be comparable to multifamily, I mean, you'd have to up that recycling education budget into the millions to accomplish the same thing, or the $1+ million range. When you consider the amount of households we have in multifamily are about twice as much as single family. So one of the big challenges there, but I think it's really due to that education.
Great. And we have one, is this recyclable question, which is like on your Twitter feed. Are the plastic containers from restaurant takeout recyclable?
Oh, that's a good one. And I would say that it's a little hard to give a ruling because there's so many different kinds of plastic containers that make up that genre. I would say that most are. We accept a very wide diversity of rigid plastic containers in DC. So number 1, plastic like soda bottles. Number 2, plastic like HDPE containers like milk jugs. Number 4, LDPE like deli containers. Number 5, like polypropylene yogurt cups or coffee cup lids. And then number 6, polystyrene. We accept rigid polystyrene, which makes up a lot of food service ware. And only 37% of American communities accept rigid polystyrene curbside. So you are very likely able to recycle it in DC. You would want to clean it out. But we accept basically all rigid plastics that are common in consumer packaging in our system. So you're most likely set there.
So does that account for the since the pandemic, we've seen so many of these black plastic containers that you get when you order takeout with that usually a clear lid?
Yeah, it's a good question, and apologies if I go off camera to find my charger for a moment, but I'm going to talk while I do that. For black plastic in our system, one of the challenges with plastic packaging is that we use what we call near infrared optical sorters to sort it at facilities. So that is basically like a laser that goes down on the conveyor belt and it senses what kind of plastic resin that the container is made of. And that works really, really well unless it's black plastic. And if it's black plastic, the optical sorters have a really challenging time telling what kind of resin it is. In some systems, they have workarounds to do it better than others, but it is a big challenge. And in our system, we know that it's pretty problematic. There are innovations in packaging. So the reason why optical sorters have a hard time identifying black dye, black colorant for packaging is because they use what's called carbon black, which is a dye that's been around forever. And they're shifting the kind of black pigments that are used in packaging to be something that optical sorters can read. So there's innovation in the space now, but the vast majority of black plastic packaging that's on the market is not that fancy new kind that can be read by optical sorters. So it's a crapshoot about whether black plastic could be sorted effectively. No cities really ban it or take it off their accepted recyclables list, but it's a factor, and we don't have as good of data on it as I would like. The other piece there is that when we think about both for plastic, but also for other materials like glass or paper or whatever, when you have colored items, it can impact the recyclability. So you can't recycle black plastic and turn it back into clear plastic in mechanical recycling. You can for new advanced recycling technology. But for mechanical recycling, if you dye plastic pink or green or black, you can only put it into opaque or colored things that you can dye from there. Some kinds of plastic have better end markets and are more accepting of colored plastic than others. So for something like a milk jug, HDPE, we have excellent colored plastic markets. But for something like PET, like soda bottles, it's really challenging. And that's why Sprite changed from green plastic to clear plastic this year, is to increase the value of plastic on the end market pretty substantially there. I know that was a bit of a tangent, but it's a really good question.
Thank you. Commissioner Pagets?
I just had one question, and then also wanted to point out, I put the link to the Zero Waste website where you can print out the flyers to hang in the trash rooms. That's been incredibly effective in my building because it shows exactly like photos of what goes where and all of that. And then also, is it possible to tour the recycling facilities?
That's such a good question, and I wish I had better news there. It's really not. DPW has not been able to create a practice where they're able to accept public tours. Frankly, it's something that was really challenging to even arrange among DC government employees, like to bring employees from sister agencies in. And part of that is with COVID, that most facilities dropped back and didn't allow any non-employees whatsoever. So for instance, during COVID, we with DPW couldn't even go to the MRFs that we contract with due to concern there. And the solid waste industry had some pretty serious COVID issues where up to 50% of collection crews in DC at the worst points in time had COVID, and it impacted schedules in a lot of places. Like Baltimore had to drop down to every other week collection. I think we're largely out of that posture. I think it would be really important moving forwards for all of our facilities to be open and available for tour. Some cities do that really well. New York City does public tours of their MRFs, and it's something they bring school kids in to see. And our facilities aren't also designed to have space where people could kind of safely stand. So transfer stations are like big concrete boxes with massive piles of stuff, and then, like a dozen trucks backing up and like zooming through at any given time. So in a perfect world, and when Benning Road is rebuilt, I am sure they will design in like safe viewing areas and corridors around where you're not like at risk of being backed up on by a truck going, but they should figure out a way in the meantime.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said with that kind of visual education, and that it becomes more impactful for
100%.
folks.
I felt the same way. The first time I was in a facility, I was like mind blown. Like it really starts to click. For sure. Something also, like, frankly, a lot of the employees that do recycling enforcement or sweep inspector enforcement for all solid waste, most of them have never been to the recycling facility. Like, when you think about how to really get people bought in and leaning into kind of cultivating that environment, I think it also would be something really important simply for the folks who are supposed to be providing those services to get into the facilities too. So much room for improvement across the board there.
Okay, we're already at 7:30. I want to pause for a moment in case there's anybody who hasn't asked a question yet, maybe off camera, who has been waiting for a chance to speak up and ask something. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question?
I see a hand up. Matthias? There we go.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, hello, Charlotte. Thank you. And Commissioner McCorriston, thank you for taking my question. Here, you gave, Charlotte, at the beginning of the presentation, one number about the total amount of trash created by the city. What I would be interested in is basically how this number has evolved over the last 10 or even 20 years. Because even probably you can hear that I haven't lived in the district all my life, but the time I lived in here, I have seen trash cans always get larger. And I realized that also creates more trash. This is, so to speak, one observation. I feel like the recycling effort probably gets canceled out by the sheer amount of trash which is produced. Because also 20 years ago in a coffee shop, I was not looked at like coming from out of space when I wanted my coffee in a real cup. Now try anything like this at Starbucks or even at the place where I work, it's utterly impossible. They may give you then 2 paper caps for whatever reason. So there I see problems. Then I'm curious also, where are the landfills? The district ships all its waste. And the only solution I see, because everything seems to be governed by money, basically the district, I think, yeah, I don't think they do a very good job collecting things like you pointed out, but essentially I think the cost of landfills is probably rather cheap, amazingly cheap here, that all this trash can be produced and get somehow carted out of the city. And yes, and that this works out, that it's somehow not, it should be actually by now better also from the dollar amount to recycle more or to produce less trash. But I see also no city regulations which essentially entice coffee shops or restaurants to spend less on packaging or be careful about the packaging. For instance, would be the first thing. If you tell me this black plastic is hard for the recycling containers, will the city say, well, if you use food containers, they cannot be black? I mean, how hard is that? But it just doesn't happen here. So, I mean, as you see, I have a number of questions, but I would like to see the overall trajectory in particular. That I would like to know.
Yeah, you raised so many good points. And I would say that you're absolutely right that reducing is really low-hanging fruit in a lot of instances. So I think there's a few places where there have been some cities that have had some success. For instance, New York City has experimented with laws that would ban printed receipts, or say that you have to opt in to get a printed receipt, or you have to have the option for an electronic receipt. You can't just automatically give someone paper copies. DC actually was the first city to pass a food serviceware requirement that said you cannot provide utensils and napkins and straws automatically. You have to request them and opt in, which is, I think, one really good low-hanging fruit reduction policy that other cities can model. But you're right that it's the tip of the iceberg. And you're right that, requiring something like, clear or transparent or white plastic instead of black would be really logical. And one of the big challenges with efforts in this area in the past few years has been high sensitivity to requirements on businesses who are struggling with the pandemic. I think we're coming out of that now, but a lot of activity, there was a lot that we were considering proposing 2-3 years ago that was shot down because it would impose increased cost to businesses. And to the point of cost with landfills, for example, I think that's an excellent point you bring up. And to provide a few numbers for folks on that piece, managing trash in DC costs about $70 a ton. Comparatively, recycling is about 120, and composting is double that. So it's kind of a predictable trend in the US when we don't have landfill taxes in place, which is something that I think would make a lot of sense. For every dollar that you spend managing trash, recycling, or per ton, I should say, for every ton of trash that you're managing, recycling costs 2 times as much and composting costs 4 times as much. So when we think about how we're going to achieve zero waste, like if we have a budget of $20 million for the recycling program in DC, for example, and we're doing, at best in the best sector, 25%, if we're going to reach 80%, that means that budget needs to triple. Like we're going to have to spend tens of millions of more dollars recycling and composting than we do in our current system. And I think there are ways we can artificially raise the price of refuse to incentivize that recycling and composting behavior, but it doesn't lower the cost of recycling and composting. And for the landfills and where they're located, DC sends exactly, ironically, like almost 50% to the nose of its trash to landfill and almost 50% on its nose to waste to energy. We use Covanta Fairfax's waste to energy facility, and then we send refuse to about 14 different landfills in Virginia and Maryland. And we're pretty unique as a big city to not export refuse farther than that. Like New York City sends stuff to like a bajillion states away. In DC, we don't go farther than the DMV, which is something, but just some context there on the geographic side. It's a really good piece. And I'll drop a link in to the 2021 waste characterization study, which is where a lot of the numbers I referenced are from. Analyzing and collecting data on the citywide waste stream is a really expensive endeavor, and most cities don't publish citywide data because of that. Most cities don't invest in the data collection for citywide streams beyond what they physically manage because it's so hard and costly to do. But DC is one of them that does do that. And I want to say we did something similar maybe like 15 years ago. This is the most recent one in kind of like contemporary time since we've had universal recycling requirements in our current legislative structure for recycling. And it's due to be repeated every 5 years due to the cost and timeline for it. It's a 6-figure effort to produce. But DPW does also, they are required to produce an annual diversion report, which shares pretty granular breakdowns of the single family residential. That's easy for them to crunch the numbers for because they control all of it, as well as the total volume, or I'm sorry, total tonnages of what facilities trash and refuse go to citywide. That's an easy number for us to assess because haulers are required to report that to the Department of Public Works. So we can say this number of tons went to landfill and these 14 landfills and these number of tons went to waste to energy. But to get the breakdown that's in this report of like how much polypropylene versus polyethylene versus aluminum cans versus aluminum foil is going to be an every 5-year ordeal for the city. So there's projections in there about the arc over time as you talk about. And I know I'm keeping people pretty long here, but a last thought on that, and due to some of the comments on reuse, hopefully might be of interest, is that it has been almost impossible for pay as you throw is one policy where we've been able to see decreases in generation on the residential side. It's less experimented with in the commercial space. That is effective. Again, that would only really be relevant for like the 10 or the 20% of our waste stream as a whole. But is a really effective tactic. We've also seen reduction in weight over time because more packaging is shifting to plastic, and plastic weighs less than paper and glass and metal. And we're also seeing that packaging, no matter the material, is getting lighter. So we're seeing per item that weight is going down, but over time, we continue to see the per capita use go up. So I think you all are totally right that more thought and attention and energy focused on reusing and reducing is valuable. And due to population growth as well, DPW and cities as a whole really don't have goals, frankly, to be totally honest, to reduce the overall amount of waste because the trend is so positive. They have goals to decrease the per capita generation of waste because that seems like the best shot we've got. But I don't think that we've been able to demonstrate meaningfully as a city that any city across sector has been able to reduce the amount of waste generated in the US, at least yet.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Matthias, for the great questions. Any other questions from the public? from the other commissioners. Commissioner Nash, you had a question earlier. You're on mute.
I am conscious of time and I wanted to thank our speaker for staying later. Just a quick question. Are all the other DC agencies aligned with DPW on recycling? And so I think in particular of the fact that at bus stations or at parks, one sees very few of the dedicated recycling cans for bottles and plastic, for example. And I don't know whether those are handled by DPR for parks or maybe by DDOT for bus routes. But the absence of those containers means that so much single-use plastic and glass goes right into trash baskets, which are often overflowing.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's one of the real areas for improvement. So we talked about the citywide diversion rate is 16%. Businesses are even worse at 7%. DC government is unfortunately way worse at 1.8%. So we recycle less than 2% of the waste of DC government. That does include public housing. DC government does not comply with its own recycling requirements in providing recycling access to public housing buildings. I testified about this at a hearing about a year ago, and they started a pilot at one of them last winter. I'd be super curious to see what progress has been made, but it's a real glaring, disappointing area that we are not living up to our own requirements in the housing stock that we manage as a city. But the same often goes in DPR community centers and facilities. There also is often very lacking recycling and lack of access. Most administrative buildings in DC government have recycling access, but not all. It's much better there, but public housing makes up a really big portion. And then exactly as you say, the public litter can situation is a really a big area for improvement. And it's a bit of a funky split up of responsibilities. So DPW collects the public trash bins. DGS contracts out the collection of public recycling bins. To be honest, why that is, I couldn't tell you. I think it's a labor and truck constraint more than anything. And then a lot of the bids manage the trash and recycling in their own domains. And some of them pick up the material themselves and some of them have DPW and DGS pick it up. So it's a totally convoluted network and there's no good rhyme or reason for why any of it the way it is. And one of the pieces of the Zero Waste Omnibus Act that passed a couple of years ago is to do a study of public litter cans. I don't believe it was ever funded, but is one thing that would help really get an assessment of the status quo, at least to understand, you know, what the situation is to improve it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, I think this is a great point to wrap up. I'd like to thank you, Charlotte, for taking time out to spend with us this evening. This has been extraordinary. Someone put a comment in the chat about good thing this is being recorded because there's been so much information. So we'll send that link around too, and I think I'll be rewatching this. This has been excellent. So with that, thank you to everyone who attended tonight and who stuck it out to the end. With that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.